Before I get started, just a couple things. First of all, I want to extend my gratitude to Judy Lipton, who is my co-director for, she's not just raised money for refugees and our legal services for them, but she is also my wonderful co-director for this program and has helped us provide all those services for human trafficking as well. Also, as far as questions go, I am more than open to people asking questions as I go along. There's a microphone right in the middle of the room, which we thought might be easily located, but I'll also try to save some time at the end for questions as well. So, 10 things you may not know about human trafficking. The first one we're going to start with is, what is human trafficking? A lot of people ask me, believe it or not, this term, human trafficking, is a fairly recent term. Up until actually the year 2000, we really didn't know what to call it when we saw it. And the reason for that is the federal law actually carved out a provision in the Victims Protection Act of 2000 and finally defined what it is that I'm going to talk to you about today. And what it is it's separated into two separate categories. There's sex trafficking, which is a commercial sex act. So it's having sex with someone else for any type of commercial gain. So it doesn't necessarily, for my clients, it's not always necessarily money. It could be drugs, it could be food, it could be shelter, but for something in return. The other is labor trafficking, and that's a little bit more obvious just from the term. So some type of force, fraud, or coercion, which is required for either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, and requiring someone to engage in some type of involuntary servitude. So that was in 2000 that the federal law decided to go ahead and define this and actually make it a crime to engage in that. Before that, it was really difficult to try to figure out what to call it. We had the Mann Act that was around forever and ever that covered kidnapping and crossing state lines. As you see, we call this trafficking, but it's not our typical way of trafficking, where drug trafficking, gun trafficking doesn't require you to cross state lines or to travel with the individual. Ohio picked this up in 2010. And believe it or not, we were one of the first 10 states to do that. So even though it took us a while, we were somewhat at the forefront of picking up the definition of trafficking. Very similar to the federal definition, where it's force, fraud, or coercion. And again, we separated it into two, even though we put it in the same provision, that it's either involuntary servitude or sexual activity for hire. What was really important is that as Ohio law kind of clarified, the compulsion element was always difficult because folks felt that, okay, how was someone compelled to engage in especially a sex activity for hire? So the law really clarified as they went along that the victim's will can be overcome by fear, duress, but also by fraud. I highlighted fraud here because I would say that's the biggest area that most of my clients fall into and the studies that most fall into. When you look at the victims, most of them are brought into, especially sex trafficking, through a friend, a boyfriend, an older person who says, hey, I'll take care of you, I'll provide you housing, I'll provide you food, I'll be your friend, I'll be like a father to you. And then after a while, they say, you need to work in order to make your money, in order to pay me back for what I'm providing you. And they're no longer quite as nice to the individual. So it's kind of that fraudulent relationship where at first there may be a really nice boyfriend. We often call them the boyfriend pimp, then later turns into the gorilla pimp that often beats them, really controls them, isolates them from everyone else that they know in order to make money off of them and exploit them. Number 9, how many people are enslaved in the world today? The estimates, this is the lowest estimate right now. There were a few studies that just came out this week that went as high as 45 million. But 20.9 million is the lowest estimate right now. This is by the International Labor Organization. Regardless, it's more than any other time in our history, which is really, I think, horrifying. It's difficult for me. I have 3 children who learn all about the 13th Amendment and the fact that we eradicated slavery in the United States. And I have to tell them that slavery is not eradicated, that we now have more slaves than any other time in our history. So what does this look like? It's going on in every country in the world, in every one of our 50 states. In fact, as Michael mentioned, it's the second largest criminal enterprise aside from drug trafficking. So here is a map of forced labor to give you some idea of where it occurs. As far as the number of folks that are being enslaved and forced into labor, you can see that the highest is around the Pacific region, the Asian Pacific region, but we have a lot of folks everywhere, 1.5 million in the developed economies, like in our area, 1.5 million in Central and Southeastern European, pretty evenly spread all over. If you break that down a little bit, remember I talked about that most people initially think trafficking, that means that these victims are being moved somewhere. They're being kidnapped and taken somewhere else, kind of, especially speaking of Taken, that movie Taken, a lot of people think, oh, that's what you do. You work in human trafficking, so you're dealing with people who are kidnapped and taken somewhere else. No, most of the people actually remain fairly close to home when they're being trafficked. So 56% remain in their place of origin. They're being victimized right near home, right near their home. The other 44% move within their actual country of origin or internationally. But as I said, the majority remain fairly close to home. Number 8, what are the annual profits attributed to human trafficking? So I mentioned that this was the second highest crime, the second most profitable crime. The latest figures are this is a $150 billion industry. To give you some perspective on that, when I was speaking on this horrible crime back in 2012, 2013, before they recalculated this in 2014, we estimated that it was at a $31 billion industry. So when they went back to recalculate it, it had quintupled. So again, pretty horrifying that it quintupled in that short a period of time. And of course, it's only growing at this point. This shows you the annual profits per region for forced labor. So while the individuals may be in certain areas, you can see that the profits are really pretty evenly distributed between the Asia-Pacific market and the developed economies like ours. So we are making a lot of money here. In the developed economies, we're making about $50 billion, pretty much the same as the Asia-Pacific market. So a lot of money being made off of exploiting folks. The annual profit per victim of forced labor, here again in the developed economies, they're making much more for each victim that's being subjected to this. So $34,000 per victim in the developed economies, and then it kind of goes down from there. The profits. So the interesting thing is that while worldwide there's much more labor trafficking going on than sex trafficking is much more profitable. And for anyone who's familiar with the trafficking field, the reason for this is when you sell someone for labor trafficking, you can usually only sell them once. So if I sell someone to a migrant farmer, or I sell someone to be a housekeeper or a domestic worker, that's one sale, and then the other person owns them, for lack of a better term. For sex trafficking, these pimps or traffickers sell these people and children over and over and over and over again. So unfortunately, it's much more profitable. So out of that 150 billion, the sex trafficking makes up 2/3 of those profits. It's much more profitable. When you look at that 51 billion that goes to labor trafficking, it's broken up into About $34 billion goes to manufacturing, construction, and mining. We just did a program the other night with Dinda Thomas from Squire Patton Boggs, and she talked a lot about mining being a huge area where labor trafficking takes place. Agriculture is about $9 billion, and domestic work is about $8 billion. And for domestic work, this is often private homes. So people will have women or children working in their home and paying them next to nothing. Here again, what I was just talking about for the sexual exploitation, you can see that for labor exploitation per victim, you can make about 4 times as much for exploiting someone sexually rather than for labor exploitation, again, because you can sell someone repeatedly. Here's an example from a Netherlands study of how much traffickers make off of victims. This was a trafficker for 4 victims. He was making $18,000 a month. Another trafficker for 3 victims who's making $21,000 a month off of exploiting these women. Another study that was done on the underground sex economy here in the US, this is the Urban Institute report. They looked at the overall sex economy in Denver, Colorado, and then in Atlanta, Georgia, in just 1 month. In 1 year. This was $39.9 million in Denver compared to $290 million in Atlanta. And some of you may have heard about Atlanta. Atlanta is often ranked #1 for sex trafficking with respect to the number of victims and also the number of profits generated per year. Yeah, I think it's because it's a large city. They also look at the number, and we'll talk about that when we talk about right now with Ohio, the number of strip clubs, the number of kind of underground sex type clubs that they have available. For some reason, and also it's somewhat like Cleveland in the way that it tends to be a kind of destination spot. People go there for business. It has a big area where folks come in for business. So for instance, when we were getting ready here for the Republican National Convention, we prepared for a year for that, for the Republican National Convention. We were prepping the police, we were prepping the hotel industry, really trying to get ready for that. Because when you have an influx of especially businessmen with discretionary income, you tend to see a really high rise in sex trafficking. People will actually bring victims in and traffic them. So Atlanta tends to have a lot of kind of business travel and that type of thing as well. Aside from that, when I get asked those questions, often I can't tell you. It boggles my mind as well as to why that happens. Does human trafficking happen here? Well, Dean Scharf already answered some of that. We're the 4th biggest state for human trafficking. We got the 4th highest number of calls last year, aside from California, Texas, and Florida. I will say, though, I think this is a double-edged sword. If we got the lowest number of calls in the country, I would be more concerned, honestly, because I think the fact that we have advocates here in Ohio, we're getting the word out, people are calling, and most of the people that call aren't victims. They're third parties who see something. We kind of say, see something, say something. So the fact that people are calling and reporting, and we have now FBI task forces here in Cleveland, we have one in Toledo, we have one in Central Ohio, in Columbus, means that things are happening and people are actually paying attention. So while I'm not thrilled that we're number 4, I also think that it means that people are actually paying attention. If we were number 50 on the list, that would concern me. The types of human trafficking that take place here in Ohio, 88% is sex trafficking. So I mentioned that that sex trafficking can tend to be more lucrative than labor trafficking. So throughout the world, it's generally considered that about 75% of the trafficking that takes place is labor trafficking, and then 25% is sex trafficking. Here in the US, it's exactly the inverse. So for instance, I know Professor Lipton and I got asked last year when we hosted delegates from all over the country right around the time of the RNC. And that was a big question they asked, was why in the US do you have so much sex trafficking? And we had a couple answers to that. I think our first answer was we are not good enough about ferreting out labor trafficking. But our second answer was internet, 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 internet. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. But why Ohio? I just mentioned some of these for Atlanta. We have a really great highway system that allows you to get north, south, east, west very easily. We're right near Canada. We have a really large number of truck stops, and a lot of trafficking, especially of underage children, takes place at truck stops. And then we have a very high number of strip clubs, which was something I didn't know until I got into this area. Aside from that, I don't know. It's kind of, I can't really get into the minds of traffickers, unfortunately, to know why we have such a high number. The origin of victims. So often we'll get asked, where are these women coming from that you work with? Are they from Thailand? Are they from India? No, all of the clients we've had so far, they're born in America. They're often born in Ohio. Like you saw before, most victims are actually trafficked very close to where they live. They're victimized very close to where they live. What does labor trafficking look like in the United States? So I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what labor trafficking looks like. I'm going to focus a little bit more on sex trafficking just because sex trafficking happens a lot more here, and also our project focuses more on sex trafficking. But the victims' educational backgrounds completely range. They are all over the place for labor trafficking victims. So some of them will come here with very little education. Some of them will come with actual graduate degrees from their country of origin for labor trafficking victims. The traffickers tend to be foreign nationals, but they also can be U.S. citizens. The most common ethnic group that they're in, or area that they're in, is males in their 30s and 40s. Recruitment tends to be informal social networks. So it tends to be kind of people that they know, a friend of a friend, that tells these folks, hey, this is a great opportunity for you. Or third-party recruiters. Again, this was something that Dinda Thomas mentioned the other night when she was talking about labor trafficking, that these recruiting companies are a huge problem. And now that there's more and more responsibilities of companies to pay attention to ethical sourcing and making sure that your contractors and subcontractors are not using slave laborers, they now have to make sure they're paying attention to these recruiters. The main thing that they do is exploit the fact that these victims want a better life. So they want a better life for them, they want a better life for their families. So they're easy, generally, to recruit to either come to America to get a better life or travel to somewhere else in America for a better life. For those who cross the border, this statistic actually shocked me. 71% enter with lawful visas. So they're not coming here illegally usually. They're coming here the right way. They're coming with their papers. But by the time their traffickers take advantage of them and they're discovered later, they have no legal paperwork. Usually what these traffickers do is charge them a really high recruitment fee I didn't have that on there. They charge them a really high recruitment fee, a really high travel fee that they can't afford. It's often as much as the annual salary for their whatever country they're coming from. And so when they get here, you owe me, it's often as much as $15,000 or $20,000, and you have to work to pay that off. So I'm taking your paperwork, you have no paperwork, you're not gonna get that back until you pay it off. And they're then basically enslaved to this person. So here's an example of something that happened. Probably a lot of you heard about this. This is a huge case here in Ohio. It was called the Marion Egg case, is how we all refer to it. This is Castillo Serrano. He was 33 years old. He lived here, but he was a Guatemalan national. He went to Guatemala and recruited primarily teenage boys. At first he had a few adults, but then he really focused in on teenage boys, like really between 14 and 17 was his kind of target group. He charged the victims a recruitment fee of $15,000 each, not something none of them had. Some of their parents actually put up the deeds to their house back in Guatemala to have them bring the boys over, have them work for a while, work towards this better life that supposedly they were going to have. Once they were here, they were working 12-hour days at this egg farm and living in these disgusting trailers that had no beds, no toilets, no running water, vermin running around in them. So it was really a horrible situation. Once it was discovered, he was prosecuted, and I think they ended up looking at going after there was like a parent company for this egg farm as well, going after them because they should have known that this was going on. But this was the first huge labor case that took place in Ohio. And it was really disturbing to see these boys and the way that they were treated. Number 5, what is the average age that a person becomes a sex trafficking victim? Between 12 and 14 years old. So that's hard for me because I have 3 kids and my twins are 12 and my son is 14. So it's tough to think about because they seem like still kind of babies to me, like they really can't make any really mature decisions. So the thought of these kids being on the streets, exploited in the worst possible way you can imagine, is really in large part the reason why I do this for a living, because no one should be in that position. So in the U.S., 325,000 children are at risk for sexual exploitation. And I have to say, that's a complete guess. The more I do this, the more I'm completely astonished that when we try to figure out, for instance, how many children are missing in the U.S., we have no idea. There are stats that as many as 2 out of 3 of the children that are missing are not even reported missing. So that just gives you some idea of how it's really difficult to know how many children are really at risk and how many children are actually missing, because so many of these children, that whole term throwaway youth, which I think is sad that that's even a term, but unfortunately there's so many children in the U.S. that are being exploited, and some people don't even know that they exist. The most vulnerable for this type of exploitation are runaways, foster youth, and juvenile offenders. So children that are in the juvenile detention center, they are often recruited to go into the sex trade business because they are having difficulty. Often they don't have strong family ties, they already have serious self-esteem issues, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the programs that we are just starting is going into the juvenile detention center and speaking to them when they're in the juvenile detention center, trying to stop some of that recruitment before it happens. A runaway, the statistics say that a runaway is approached within the first 48 hours to go into the sex trade. 1 out of every 6, in the last 6 months they've changed that to 1 out of every 5 runaways is estimated to be engaged in sex trafficking. In Ohio, again, it's really tough to have a statistic on this because we don't know how many children actually are out there, but the statistic is up to 3,000 children are at risk for being trafficked every year. According to the FBI, it is, quote, the most overlooked and under-investigated form of child sexual abuse facing American society today. So for children, their vulnerability is just anything you can imagine because they don't have just those basic needs, for instance, food and shelter. This is from an article about child sex trafficking where a minor was interviewed and she refused to prosecute her pimp because, quote, he gets me a Subway sandwich whenever I want one. That's how desperate she was just to have food. Another one, just the need for love and family. Sexually exploited teens are not motivated by lust or greed, they're lured by love, which often makes sense because when you hear pimps, they want to be called daddy. That's the most common term that they want to be called. Often now, a huge thing now is that they'll brand their girls. They'll have a tattoo on all of their girls. And often the most common one you'll see is still daddy or some kind of tattoo like that, which is really horrible because these girls so want someone to take care of them and to protect them, but he's the person that most exploits them. Here is a quote from a federal agent. The pimps are out there and they're not smart, but they are master manipulators, and they can identify the one thing in her life that she's missing and fill that void. So number 4, is there such a thing as a child prostitute? So can you call a child who's engaging in sex, in commercial sex, a prostitute? This is definitely a huge area of kind of contention right now in America. So under federal law, no. So you can't have child and prostitute. They kind of clash because the definition of trafficking basically does away with that. It says that sex trafficking is a commercial sex act that's induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or if it's performed by someone that's under 18 years of age. So if you're under 18 years of age, if you're a 15-year-old girl and you're engaging in a commercial sex act with a 35-year-old man and you're discovered, you're automatically treated as a victim because clearly he's exploiting you, and you can't make a conscious decision to sleep with him for a sandwich or for drugs or for whatever reason, for money, if you're desperate for money. So most of these children are engaging in what's called survival sex, and that makes them a victim. They're not able to make that conscious choice. That's how the federal law looks at it. In Ohio right now, yes, they can be prosecuted for prostitution. So we just have a prostitution statute that says whoever violates this is guilty of prostitution, which is a misdemeanor of the 3rd degree. So the first time I came across this was I had a client who was arrested. She was 16 years of age. She was at one of those kind of sleazy hotels with 3 other girls that were, if anything, younger than her. They ranged from 14 to 16. The police report said that the pimp who was there, he was in his 30s, and he picked the girls up, brought them to the room, brought them each their own burner phone, that throwaway phones, and they would each be assigned a phone number, and then the customers, or Johns, as they're called, would call the phone number and decide which girl he wants. He would have the phone number associated with the girl he wanted. Again, these are 14 to 16-year-old girls. The pimp would then answer the phone, and then the girls would leave the room when a John came in, and then once they were done, they would come out and give the pimp half the money that was paid by the customer. When she was found with no money, so clearly she was giving him all her money, and she had no property in her possession. She was arrested, and she was charged with soliciting prostitution and drug possession, even though she didn't have any, but she did admit that she was smoking marijuana in there. So my argument was, how can you charge a 16-year-old girl who's clearly being pimped out of a hotel room by a 33-year-old male with soliciting prostitution? How can you charge her as a criminal for that? So we made many arguments, including, first of all, preemption, that frustrates the purpose of the federal law. How can you be a victim for the exact same act that you're a criminal? That seems to frustrate the purpose of the federal law. We also argued that it conflicts with certain advances in Ohio law. So we have had certain advances, especially in 2012 and 2014, that have made penalties higher for Johns or pimps with respect to minors. So now, for instance, under compelling prostitution, if you engage in sex, if you compel prostitution and you engage in sex with a minor, or you pay a person, even if you just believe the person to be a minor, so that can include those kind of stings that you might be involved with on the internet. If it's a 16 to 18-year-old victim, it's now a felony of the 2nd degree. If it's an under 16-year-old victim, it's a felony of 1st degree. So that's a huge move, because before that, Johns generally just got a slap on the wrist. It was a misdemeanor. Maybe they had to go to John school for a weekend and learn about sex ed or something like that. But now, sleeping with children was a huge penalty for them. It was a felony regardless of whether it turned out to be a child or not for those sting situations. And then I made other points too, was that like a minor under 18 isn't allowed to contract. So if we're talking about a commercial sex act, the child isn't allowed to contract. And then just some common sense, like a child under 18 isn't allowed to go to a strip bar, isn't allowed to go to a strip club, bar, drink alcohol, buy cigarettes, but somehow she can be prosecuted for a prostitution offense. So those were the arguments that we made. In all of those situations so far that we've had, usually they've had another crime, and so the prosecutor has just dismissed the prostitution offense, and we've settled out on the other crime. But in February, Teresa Fetter, the representative from Toledo who has worked on human trafficking rights, including those enhancements for minors that I just showed you. We did a press conference along with her where she said that she wants to work to put an end to this, where we're not going to have a law in Ohio that allows prosecutors to charge any folks under 18 with a crime. So this is a picture from our press conference that we did where we said that, or basically I was quoted saying that your children are exploited when they're engaging in a commercial sex act. They're victims, they're not prostitutes. We shouldn't be calling children prostitutes. That's a huge problem with what we're doing right now. So right now we're in the process of, we've already drafted a bill. She's trying to get co-sponsors right now, and hopefully that'll be passed soon. Number 3, this is the biggest one. This is a huge thing that I actually talk about a lot. And it, I think, is a huge thing if any of you have any children or grandchildren or know anyone, because the internet has so affected all of our lives, and it certainly has affected sex trafficking. So I'll try to be as brief as I can. I tried to give you a glimpse of how it's affected without spending 2 hours just on this alone, because it's huge. But as far as the internet and trafficking sex online, in the last 5 years alone, this is according to the U.S. government. Actually, Rob Portman, who's a senator, Republican senator from Ohio, he chairs the subcommittee that did a lot of investigations into internet sex trafficking. So I got a lot of the information from there as well. The last 5 years, there's been an 846% increase in reports of suspected child sex trafficking, and that has been directly correlated to the increased use of internet. So almost all of those cases had something to do with the use of internet. This is what I try to explain to folks all the time, is that the internet has made it so difficult for us as advocates to try to get a handle around sex trafficking, because in the old days, you kind of had the pimp with his, he calls them his stable of prostitutes, and they would work the streets. Now, the pimp can go ahead and put an advertisement on 5 different websites for one girl on 5 different websites and have hundreds of responses, and he's not putting himself at risk at all. So it's high profit, low risk. And so it's very difficult to imagine how this isn't going to continue to grow. So high profitability, low risk. Backpage, who I'm going to talk about a lot because they've gotten a ton of exposure over the last year, and they are by far the biggest internet advertiser of sex. They got 80% of their revenue from online commercial sex trafficking in the US. They're very, if you're not familiar with Backpage, they're very similar to a Craigslist, where they have all different categories, but their adult escort category was by far generating most of their revenue. In 2008, Backpage's profits were $5.3 million. Once they started getting more and more involved in the sex advertising business, they went up to $135 million by 2014. As far as children being trafficked, there were more than 400 documented cases in 47 states that were through Backpage.com. And these are just cases that were documented. One child that was interviewed about this said, "You can't buy a child at Walmart, but you can go to Backpage and buy me on Backpage." So some of the things I'm going to show you might be kind of disturbing, but you can go right online. Backpage is not the dark web. This is just regular website. So, I'm sorry. I'll give you that disclaimer ahead of time that this is definitely upsetting. This is a district attorney's opinion saying that it's a dystopian hell. That's what Backpage is. So in the last year, there's been a multi-front war against Backpage. Credit card industry, civil lawsuits, criminal lawsuits, and the government. I can't talk to you about all of them, but the credit card industry, starting with Chicago, the Chicago district attorney made a plea to the credit card industry saying, hey, stop letting this disgusting organization charge through your credit cards for sex, essentially, especially sex with children. So all of the major credit cards pulled out, and then Backpage sued, saying this is a restraint on free speech, this is a restraint, and they actually won. So he had to actually send out a letter saying, okay, I didn't mean it, because the court looked at it as him essentially putting pressure on the credit cards. The credit card still said, yeah, we don't want to do business with you anymore. We're not going to go back to doing business with you. Unfortunately, it didn't make a difference at all, because they use Bitcoin, which is a new way of, and so their profits just continued to go up, 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 up. So the first thing, unfortunately, did not make a difference at all. Then civil lawsuits came, well, actually around the same time, civil lawsuits came, and I'll show you a little bit, just a taste of the civil lawsuits. So one of the big things that the civil lawsuits allege was that, look, Backpage, you're allowing and you're actually encouraging with some of the instructions that Backpage would give advertisers, them to use known signifiers for children. So for those in the know, I'm sure none of us know this, but if you're in the know, and there's certain signifiers that mean that this is a child, because you can't go on anything and say, hey, I'm advertising someone under 18, that's illegal. Just like you can't come out and say, I'm advertising sex, that's illegal. But it's all a wink, wink, nod, nod kind of thing. Same things for some of these terms. So girl, fresh, tiny, roses, I don't know why, but there's these terms that I guess are known signifiers for those in the know that this means that she's underage. This means that you're going to get someone that's underage. When you attempt to enter your true age, if you're under 18, Backpage will instruct you that you have to enter 18 or older. So it doesn't kick you off, it doesn't do anything like that. It just says, hey, no, you got to enter 18 or older. So here's just some anecdotal data that we picked, that I had some of my law clerks do last summer from the RNC, because we were looking to see, does it go up? Do the Backpage advertisements go up, or do we see more underage during the RNC? And we certainly did. We saw some of the same tattoos over and over again. We saw things like this, which shows that there's a pimp involved. When you see two ads that are exactly the same, but it's just different people. So the one girl's name was Yellow, the other girl's name was Slim, but then everything else was the same as far as the phone number, the wording, so you know that it's one guy advertising, or it could be a girl, one person advertising multiple people. These young children being advertised here in Cleveland during the RNC. So for this type of stuff, this is an example from one of the lawsuits, that basically the legal argument was that, look, Backpage, you're structuring this so that you can camouflage your advertisements to scoot through the government inspection so that you can get through law enforcement. And they knew how to do it. They knew how to avoid it. And the response to all these lawsuits was always the same, the Communications Decency Act. Look, we have this Communications Decency Act. There's an exemption for third-party internet providers. It says that you can't be treated as a publisher or speaker. You're just providing the format, so you can't be treated treated as a speaker. And this was put out back in the mid-90s when the internet was just starting to flourish, and it was really intended to encourage folks to provide platforms so that people will provide more internet platforms, and this will really flourish even more. So this was always the response, and generally these lawsuits kept getting dismissed until this Washington lawsuit that was in September 2015. The plaintiff's argument there was that, look, this is really the content rules of Backpage transform them from just this intermediary, just this neutral host, to an actual original speaker of the information. And it basically turned, the court said, look, it's going to turn on whether or not they just merely hosted the ads or they helped develop content. And a big thing that the courts looked at and that the government ended up looking at was they had these moderators, which most internet company hosts have, which go through and edit things before things finally go up on, go live on the internet. And the moderators were often taking out things or changing things a little bit so that it would, again, coast through under government, any type, so that it wouldn't be stopped by the government, but it was still clearly advertising sex, especially sex with young people. So this was the first civil suit that went past the motion to dismiss stage. The court said it's important to decide whether the Backpage designed its posting rules to induce sex trafficking. And the court ended up saying, look, the Communications Decency Act was not meant to create a lawless no man's land on the internet. That wasn't the purpose back in the 90s. Interestingly, just 3 weeks ago, I think today or just a few days ago, the Representative Ann Wagner, who is a Republican from Missouri, just introduced a new amendment to the Communications Decency Act. It's called Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and this got a lot of bipartisan support. And what it essentially does is remove that immunity for criminal prosecutions and civil suits for the Communications Decency Act. It's getting a lot of reaction on both sides. A lot of internet providers, including Yahoo, Facebook, are really against it because they're worried this is going to be a slippery slope. If you're going to start taking away immunity here for traffickers, then are you going to start taking away immunity for us? Because there's definitely trafficking that's going on Facebook as well. So there's a real concern about that from internet providers. The government versus Backpage, some of you might have heard of this because this is definitely kind of precedential. The U.S. Subcommittee on Investigations, as I said, Rob Portman chairs that, really started looking into sex trafficking on the internet and focused a lot on Backpage. They looked a lot at how Backpage edits and strips out certain content of the ads before publishing. They subpoenaed Backpage. It went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the subpoena. Then it came all the way to hours before the Senate hearing in January. Backpage decided to shut down its adult ads section. They announced that they were going to shut down their adult ad section. And then Carl Ferrer and his other two partners came in. Carl Ferrer is the owner of Backpage, came in and asserted the fifth, said that we're not going to say anything to the Senate. So the response to that was, we don't really know if this is going to make a difference. When you look at Backpage, they still have a dating part of Backpage, and there's a lot of sex advertising that's going on there. So a lot of people assume that, look, everything's just going to move to another part of Backpage, even though they took down their adult ads. So this is Andrea Powell, who's an advocate in the area, that said this is just a publicity stunt. They took that down in order to look like they were giving in, but they're still advertising girls. Rob Portman, spokeswoman, said this shows how unserious Backpage is about protecting women and young girls. It also underscores the need for a long-term solution to ensure that websites can't facilitate this type of criminal sex trafficking. This is another assistant district attorney said, it would be a mistake for investigators or prosecutors to assume that trafficking is going to decrease because of the shutdown of Backpage escort ads. And whenever I talk about Backpage, everyone always asks me, well, what if it completely goes away on Backpage? Is that really the solution? And I always say, I know, it's not necessarily a solution, because the problem is that ads will just probably go somewhere else. And the good thing about Backpage is that it's probably the single biggest investigative tools that the FBI and the local sheriffs use to try to track down these pimps and investigate these type of cases. And while Backpage, I think, has done a lot of horrible things to try to profit off of sex trafficking, they do respond to subpoenas, sometimes like within the day, sometimes within a few hours. So they do respond to subpoenas once you ask them for information, especially if it deals with an underage victim. Okay, why do we allow for intervention for sex trafficking victims? So why have we now kind of turned this corner and said, instead of prosecuting them, we should allow for intervention? It's kind of dispensing with that myth, I think, like that kind of pretty woman myth that hey, prostitution is a victimless crime, that it really doesn't hurt anyone. Last year, well, now it's been about a year and a half, when Amnesty International came out with their announcement that they are in favor of decriminalizing prostitution, just making it, legal, and therefore it might be easier to just regulate it. There was a lot of backlash to that, especially from a lot of trafficking victims. And Rachel Moran was one. She has written books on her trafficking situations, her trafficking experiences. And she explained that when you're going through trafficking, these are the type of effects that you go through: beatings, degradations, threats. I would say the biggest thing that shocked me when I started working more and more with clients was I assumed that they got beat repeatedly by their pimps. I was surprised at how much violence they suffered from Johns. Like, Johns often were much more violent with them than even the pimps. So it's a very violent, difficult life that they lead. So a San Francisco study said that in that 70% of the women were raped. In a Portland, Oregon study, the women were raped on average once a week. The mental effects in a study that 68% of the survivors suffer from PTSD. I'm surprised all of my clients suffer from PTSD, so that seems like a low number. 50% of the survivors had attempted suicide. These are some testimonials where clients had talked about, or victims had talked about what happened to them. This woman's talking about having someone pull out a knife on her and worried that she was going to die. This woman's talking about how she had stab wounds all over her body and being raped 40 or 50 times. These are John quotes, Johns that were agreed to be interviewed. I use them like I might use any other amenity, a restaurant, or a public convenience. In prostitution, you can pick who you like. It's like going to a vending machine. So we know that it's referred to as the world's oldest profession, but it's actually the world's most dangerous profession. More so than fishermen, who's usually rated the most dangerous profession, loggers, or pilots. In fact, the workplace homicide rate for prostitutes is 51 times that of the next most dangerous occupation for women, which is working in a liquor store. That's the next most dangerous occupation. This just gives you a sense of what the life does to you. This is a woman who, these are like her pictures when she would get arrested over the time, like the drugs, the beatings, living on the street. The average lifespan, if you are a sex trafficking victim, is 34 years old. So again, pretty difficult life. So what are we doing about it? What are we doing to try to help in this area? And then I want to just give a few minutes for questions. We focus on three things. The first is representing both minor and adult human trafficking victims. Like I said, we focus a lot on sex trafficking, but we are open to labor trafficking as well. We just haven't had a lot of referrals in that area yet. But we work with both the juvenile and the adult. They both have safe harbor courts for sex trafficking victims. Another huge thing, as you saw, is that we advocate for legislative reform. And this is really huge because we are an academic institution, so we have some credibility there. We've already been working with legislators. But also, it's huge because if we can change some of these laws, we can help 1,000 people by changing a law rather than just 1 or 2 clients with some of the work that we do. So it's definitely a really important part of our mission. And then finally, providing education and awareness for lawyers, service professionals, the community. We work in the prisons, we work in the hospitals, we work with the transportation industry, hospitality industry. We really try to work in any area where folks can understand both the laws, but also what effect this has on the victims to really kind of change the community view of what kind of human trafficking is and what effect it has on the victims, and hopefully to work with the victims to get them, provide them those holistic services to get them back into society so that they can change their lives. And that's all. So I think we still have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any.
I do.
Sure.
I know I'm not going to like the answer to this question, but what happened to those children involved in the egg case?
So as far as I know, they were here for a while. I know they were kept in. They took them to hotels they never went back to the egg farm again. They were in hotels. I don't know if I don't know if they went back to Guatemala or not. Yeah, but that is a really good question because you're absolutely right. In most of the labor trafficking cases, they do get shipped back to their country of origin because, like I said, they don't have their papers, and most of the ICE individuals are not properly trained on how to deal with that. So that's one thing, especially for trafficking victims, that we're trying to focus on. I mean, especially there because they would qualify for T visas, for trafficking visas, but what about their family? So they would have to have, a sponsoring person here who would be willing to have them live with them and things such as that as well. So it's a huge, huge problem that a lot of times not only do they go through all of that to come here, but then they get shipped right back and they're not treated well by immigration as well.
Where do our rates of human trafficking and sex trafficking fall compared to other countries throughout Europe and Asia, and is the international community working together? Because I imagine that this is not just a kind of domestic problem, but an international problem. I understand that you said that most of the sex trafficking is happening locally, but I imagine that's true throughout the European Union, is there any international cooperation?
So we come out with something called the TIP report every year, which looks at every country and every region. So your first question about how bad is it in the U.S., I mean, we're not ranked as one of the top countries. Like Thailand is usually pretty high up there. So is India. Dominican Republic tends to have a lot of issues. Like, it's interesting, and we're trying to look into this. Like in the Dominican Republic, for instance, they have legalized prostitution. So and I'm not a fan of legalized prostitution, and this is one of the reasons why is they're right next to Haiti. So what happens in the Dominican Republic, for instance, is that they will have a lot of folks come over from Haiti. Even a lot of the children are sold by their families from Haiti because they're so poor, come over from Haiti. And then the Dominican Republic cops really don't pay attention because they'll say, they look like they're 18, and the child is maybe 14 or 15. So it's become almost an excuse to not pay attention, to the extent that I do a mission there every year with my husband. He's a dentist, so we go for a few days, and so I looked into human trafficking there, and a gentleman that has a mission there for human trafficking hired a cop and went to the kind of bar, like they have just tons of bars, and he said to the cop, "Can you show me where the child trafficking is going on? Like, pick which bar." And the cop said, "Pick any bar. Pick any bar, and there will be tons of children trafficking themselves in any bar there." Like, it was just so rampant there. So it's definitely, I think you can see cause and effect in some countries because of that. Also because of really increased poverty. Poverty is definitely a huge factor as well. But like I said, I think any numbers, for us to try to quantify it would be disingenuous, because I think even the numbers here in the US, we don't know for sure.
Happens in massage parlors.
Yeah, massage parlors. So we kind of have a list. One of the pieces of legislation that we're trying to work on is enforce both training and then also posting of materials. So there are these posters that explain what human trafficking is, has the 1-800 number, et cetera, that are available for kind of high-risk establishments, which includes hotels, massage parlors, nail salons, migrant farms, sporting events, sporting places, and places like that. Though it's a huge issue there. And I think it's not just posting the materials, but I think it's also doing training and making sure that you're paying attention, training the folks that work there so that they understand the signs and that they're paying attention. But yeah, it's a huge issue.
Are there any statistics on how bad the sex trafficking is in places like Las Vegas where it's legal, prostitution is legal?
Yeah, so like I was just saying, I think we have tried to look into that. I think it's technically not legal in Vegas. I think there's certain parts of Nevada that it's legal, but it depends. There's like a few counties but technically it's not in Las Vegas. Yeah. So yes, so that's what we've kind of seen so far from looking into it, is that if anything, I think the thought was that, and this is kind of how Amnesty International felt, was that if you decriminalize it, if you make it legal, then it's almost like when we talk about, for instance, smoking marijuana. Like, you take it out of the dark, and then we can just regulate it, and everything will be fine. It'll take away the violence attributed to it. It'll take away other things attributed to it. And then the victims will feel more comfortable going to cops for help and because none of the victims have ever felt comfortable going to anyone for help. The problem with that is, I think, certainly like the moral, ethical part, because I think the big reason that victims are beaten up or there's violence, that it's kept in the dark, is not necessarily because it's illegal. Like, I'm not sure most of the Johns that are sleeping with prostitutes are married, are in serious relationships. So that's a bigger impediment to them to finding out than getting a misdemeanor or a possible misdemeanor and having that. So there's kind of an ignorance of that fact, that to a certain extent, us making prostitution legal doesn't mean that prostitutes won't get beat up. It doesn't mean that the men won't. They're still paying them for sex, so the way that they treat them won't necessarily be any different. It also doesn't mean that the cops will look at them any differently either. So it's trying to understand kind of that dichotomy. For instance, none of my clients are in favor of prostitution being legal, as far as that goes. But do we have like any definitive studies? No, but we are trying to look into that, because that's been a huge issue, especially since Amnesty International came out with their stance on it. But I will say most advocates in the area are not in favor of that.
How many of the victims ask for assistance if they've been arrested for other crimes with regards to theft or drug abuse? How many of them identify themselves as a victim of a human trafficking act to get assistance in that?
Usually zero. So most of our clients don't identify as a victim. It's usually requires, like I was just looking yesterday, we're one of the highest percentage of folks that identify them are probation officers. So you kind of need to look. It's usually someone in the court, a police officer, probation officer, judge, who sees that they're showing indications of being involved in the sex trafficking trade, but most of them, they don't view themselves as a victim. They view themselves as a criminal. They view themselves as horrible, as dirty, they've been treated badly by pretty much everyone that you can imagine. The stories that they tell me are pretty horrifying. So by every people on the street, the way that some of my clients have been treated by judges even, is really sad.
So how do they end up getting your help?
So realize that it's only been since 2010 that we've recognized human trafficking, and it's been within the last few months. So now there are more organizations. So we get referrals from everyone. We get referrals from the Rape Crisis Center. We get referrals from the court. There now are 2 courts that do identify. So for instance, one of my clients got arrested on a drug charge, but they identified that she's showing signs of being trafficked. So then when they identify that, they have someone interview her, and then they will say, okay, like, you qualify to be on the safe harbor docket. Would you like these services? And so then I got her that way. Then I will have people that just hear about our project and call me. I've had investigators, when the investigator comes in and does an arrest, they will say, Maureen, you have to represent this person because she's clearly a victim. She's clearly being pimped. But she doesn't see herself as a victim, usually. So we're getting referrals from pretty much anyone. Sometimes the prosecutor will call me and say, look, we have her. She's cooperating in this, testifying against the pimp, but she needs someone to advocate for her. So it's really from all over. But definitely it's a real concern that most of them don't see that they're deserving of services or that they've been victimized. They see that they feel that they're a criminal and that they're not deserving of any help at all.
What can we as members of the general public do?
So there's, several things that you can do. The one big thing is, to raise awareness, to tell other people about this. Obviously, contributing financially to our organization or to there's other great organizations too, is obviously a big help as well. There's also organizations where you can volunteer your time to help survivors too. So there's lots of ways that you can help, but I think a big thing is also to raise awareness and to let folks know kind of what's happening, because I still think for it being such a huge crime, it's pretty much kept in the dark.
So obviously I understand that there's, a big thing in the country about searching the internet for child pornography and different things like that, but I noticed at least up here you show pictures of a woman who was even into her adult years as she'd been pimped out. And is there any sort of push to look at adult pornography on the internet to see if any, or should there be more of a crackdown to see? Because how do we know if any of those people are being trafficked or pimped? You certainly don't have to be a child, but pornography is rampant. What is there any sort of push in the country to regulate that or make sure that people involved in that, even in homemade porn, are not being trafficked?
So that's a huge issue, that often pornography is either going along with trafficking or is kind of the gateway to trafficking for a lot of these victims. So often they'll be kind of recruited to, hey, do you want to do modeling or do you want to do something like that? And then all of a sudden they're being pushed into something horrible. And often it's because, they're poor, they don't have any resources, et cetera. But pornography is a huge issue on many levels. And whenever we go to, I have a conference in DC every year, and they used to, I'm trying to remember what the name of it is, but it's the National Center of, I think it's Sexual Exploitation, and that's their primary focus is on pornography and the fact that it directly feeds into the trafficking industry, absolutely, and I think it also directly feeds into the violence in the trafficking industry, because when you look at mainstream pornography now, it is so violent and they'll completely, that's all it's so violent and degrading to women. And they talk about how there's kind of a direct link between that, and a lot of John's are either have addictions to pornography or certainly use it quite a bit, especially because it's so available now, like compared to when I was a kid and, no, it was like maybe, boys would try to get like a penthouse from under their dad's bed or something. Like now it's like it's completely available. And so it's really raised the addiction rate to the extent that it's a huge, huge problem. The problem is that, like you said, child pornography is illegal. So we always we work actually quite a bit, like the trafficking prosecutors across the street are often both in trafficking and also in the internet crimes against children unit. But believe it or not, like the biggest thing that we're focusing on now and the biggest issues now are what children are sending of themselves to other people. Like a huge, huge, huge problem is that these children are sexting things to other people, or they're going online and they're sending inappropriate things. So there's a new huge problem. This is what the National Center for Missing and Exploiting Children are focusing on, is this cyber exploitation, extortion, which is when she sends something and then it's maybe just slightly inappropriate, and this guy will write, or this pedophile will write back and say, hey, if you don't send me something else more explicit, I'm going to tell your parents, I'm going to tell everyone you know, and then all of a sudden this child is in this cycle, and it's a huge problem now, believe it or not. Like, and these kids that really shouldn't, there's been lots in my district, which is in an affluent district in Chagrin Falls, where these kids have been amazingly doing completely inappropriate things, and it's a huge problem. It's a huge issue right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much for